Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this discussion. My name is Myriam Cherti, and I'm a senior researcher at Compass, which is the Centre on Policy and Society at Oxford University. The title of my presentation today is British Muslim Faith Supplementary Schools, Building Bridges or Walls. So this presentation is based on a research that I've done a few years ago, between 2010 and 2011, at the Institute of Public Policy Research based in London, which is a think tank. And yeah, I would like to first start with some kind of more, with some more general statements before I move to the kind of British Muslim Faith Supplementary Schools. I'd like to start with three kind of general statements about faith organizations in the migration context. I think it's important to remind ourselves that faith organizations play a key role in relation to integration experiences for many migrants, whether they are kind of new migrants who have just come to the host country and try and settle down, and so these organizations serve as a safety net for these migrant groups, but also as mediums for the preservation of the identity of the next generation. And this is more specific to the supplementary schools. The second statement is that religious affiliations have always, or can always be perceived as obstacles to integration. And again, if we look at the kind of term social capital, which defines three different types of social capital, there's the bonding of social capital, so people who are like us, so from the same community, the bridging, where we kind of reach out to other people from different kind of backgrounds and different interests, and then the linking, which goes to much wider on a wider scale. So I think faith organizations have always been perceived as ones that are rich with bonding type of social capital and not enough bridging and linking social capital. So essentially saying that these organizations contribute to the exclusion rather than inclusion of these individuals into the wider society. And then the final statement is that the challenge always remains of how faith organizations can reach out to wider communities without isolating themselves from the rest of society. And I think it's important to reflect on this last point without thinking of specific faith organizations. So I think it's important to widen it to other faith groups, whether they're of Jewish background or Christian backgrounds, because essentially they do have the same purpose. They want to kind of preserve and strengthen the religious identity of their people or of the next generation. And so I think it's important not to just perceive some organizations as more exclusionary than others. Now I'd like to move to the, I think before I move to the madrasa's research, I think it's important to remind ourselves of the context of the debate around British Muslim faith supplementary schools. In the UK, the debate has always been quite polarized. So we have supporters of faith schools, which point to their strong kind of academic results and their potential to promote diversity and tolerance, etc. And other concerns, often highlighted by the media, which show that these institutions contribute to the radicalization of young people, of their exclusion, etc. And I think the events of 9/11 or 7/7, and more recently the kind of Trojan horse schools kind of debate in Birmingham really emphasizes the fact that British Muslim supplementary schools have come under additional scrutiny for the role they can play in facilitating the radicalization of young Muslims. However, these fears, we think that they're still based more on media speculation, and I think there is still very little hard evidence to kind of back that up. So moving on to the research I mentioned, and which is kind of the basis for the rest of the presentation. So this madrasa's research was based at, as I said, was done at the Institute of Public Policy Research between 2010 and 2011, and its key aims were to try and go rather head-on and address the issue of the kind of the myth surrounding madrasas. So start by mapping out the type of madrasas that exist, generate some evidence based on the role and the kind of impact these madrasas have, whether on kind of educational achievement or on an identity or community cohesion. And then enhance the engagement of educational institutions and local authorities with madrasas. So far, there is very little engagement, and I'll discuss that later in the presentation. There's very little engagement with different authorities with these institutions. So, you know, part of it is just kind of the absence of information about these institutions and how to deal with them, etc. And then finally, as with most kind of reports produced at the Institute, we had a number of recommendations to promote good practice within and across madrasas in the UK. So briefly about the methodology. So we had both kind of desk-based research and also primary data collection and analysis. So the first one was based on a literature review. Again, very little information out there, but we tried to kind of survey the existing information. The second one was a media analysis, which was published in a separate paper called Madrasas in the British Media, which surveys online articles that cover madrasas being published between 2001 and 2010. So to try and see if there's been some correlation between events like 9/11 or 7/7 and the coverage around the madrasas as kind of sources or breeding ground of radicalization, and so the association between those wider events and the madrasas. And then the primary research kind of data and analysis was multi-sited, so we had researchers based in London, Leicester, Birmingham and Bradford. And we've started with kind of, because we want to map out these madrasas, so we started with the ambitious task of trying to survey these madrasas. So we've sent a survey to over 800 probably madrasas, and we've had about 179 responses. So these surveys were really trying to kind of identify the type of madrasas that exist, what sort of funding they had, what kind of linkages they had with the community, etc. And then we had 4 deliberative workshops. So these are kind of focus groups, but they were a bit more advanced in terms of structure. So we tried to involve in these focus groups current and former madrasa students. We had also imams, teachers, and kind of Muslim community representatives. And then we had parents, and we had kind of stakeholders, so local authority representatives and voluntary organization representatives. So we kind of general discussions, and then we divided the discussions into separate groups to get feedback on separate issues, so without trying to influence the answers of the children, for instance, by their parents or their teachers. And then we had 48 in-depth interviews to follow up on some of those workshops. And those again were with current and sort of past madrasa students, parents, madrasa teachers, etc. And then finally we did 21 stakeholder interviews, which were conducted with academics, staff in education departments and mainstream schools, as well as representatives from local authorities in those 4 locations. And these interviews really tried to help us understand the nature of any initiatives which attempt to engage with madrasas, as well as to identify factors that might limit the kind of success of these initiatives. I think before going any further, it's really important to try and define what we mean by madrasas. Of course, madrasas have got different meanings, and they're well, if we look at the media, madrasas are often referred to as kind of overseas-based kind of Islamic schools, often loaded with negative kind of connotations. And but then madrasas here, I think this definition is much closer to what we mean by madrasas in this research. So these are supplementary schools for the Muslim community that are set up to deliver Islamic education in order to preserve religious, cultural and linguistic identities. They particularly deal with the Quran, and Muslim supplementary schools operate either from local mosques or are set up independently for the sole purpose of teaching the Quran and Islam. In terms of financial income for those schools, it's mainly generated through fees, funding, and mostly donations from the local community. And this definition really, once we start looking at the findings from our survey and from the qualitative research, we really think that this is a definition that kind of matches the most. I think it's worth mentioning before I go to I cover the profile of madrasas. I think it's really important to mention that the definition, however, of madrasas really differed across the different sites of the research. So, for instance, in London, when we did the workshops, participants were very proud to use the term. No, I think they were rejecting the term kind of madrasas. They were referring to supplementary school, Islamic supplementary schools. While up north, people wanted to regain that, so they were very proud to use the term madrasas despite the negative connotations, because they said, you know, we have to use the term madrasas to try and dispel some of those myths surrounding madrasas, because if we keep madrasas as only the kind of overseas institutions that are kind of have as a mission to radicalize young people, then we're kind of just giving in to that debate. So in terms of profile of madrasas, here you could see from the majority have got over, well actually 26% have got over 140 pupils, but most classes have got a reasonable number of kind of pupils, so between 10 to 20. The other thing is that they're oversubscribed. There's a kind of 1/3 of all the madrasas had a long waiting list, which also indicates a kind of a demand for these type of institutions across generations. And in terms of turnover, so sources of funding, it is striking to see that none of these madrasas had any no, sorry, I think I've gone. Yeah, no, sorry. In terms of turnover, you could see that the kind of the size of these madrasas is fairly kind of small. So only 1% has got a turnover of 100K or 100,000 pounds, but the majority really operated on the small budget between sort of 10,000 to 50,000. Or even, yeah, or slightly higher. In terms of sources of funding, it's striking to see that none of these madrasas had any government funding, central government funding, and only 2% had local funding, local authorities funding, and the majority dependent on pupil fees or donations from parents. So I think, you know, this corresponds to the sort of the willingness to maintain a degree of independence from kind of intervention from other funders, and particularly kind of whether it's local authorities, but also I think maybe we should it could be also perceived as non-willingness of other of these authorities to engage with them. So it's kind of it could be viewed both sides. Most of these madrasas operated from mosques or their own premises, although a few of them also operated from kind of mainstream schools, which is another kind of positive indication of linkage, you know, building kind of linkages with mainstream schools. We were also surprised to see that 70% of them were registered charities. So again, this is a positive indication in terms of wanting to be seen as accountable, visible, and, you know, we've got nothing to hide, so, you know, we have to submit our reports and we're transparent, etc. And 3% of them were companies. Of course, there is still about 27% of them that weren't registered, but I think the 70% is still a positive one. In terms of policies, what sort of policies they had in place, well, we had 81% of them had child protection policy, and then 78 of them had CRB checks, and then 91% had health and safety policies. So again, maybe a bit disconcerting to see that, you know, still almost kind of, well, 28% of them don't have any CRB checks, and they're working with children and all that. So, but we'll discuss that later. These institutions have got a high kind of religious focus. So 97% of them teach Quran, 70% of them teach culture and heritage, or other kind of, well, mostly Islamic teaching, and then 28% teach or give support for mainstream subjects. And this again was quite refreshing to see that, you know, these institutions are also concerned about the educational performance of their children, and they want to give them extra support in terms of their mainstream subjects, and they're not completely isolated. And in terms of teaching background, so we had 57% of the schools required teachers to have theological training, and 14% required official teaching qualifications. So again, another 50% had qualified teacher status. So this shows that there is a strong emphasis on the kind of theological teaching, and much less on kind of the teacher qualification, which, you know, would be reflected in the kind of percentage of overseas teachers in these institutions compared to those who were born and brought up in the UK. I think it's only 1/3 of the teachers who were brought up in the UK, born and bred in the UK, and the majority were from overseas. Here I would like to talk very briefly about how madrasas are regulated. It's important to remind ourselves that there is no single system of registration for these madrasas, or single body that regulates their activities, although the majority are attached to mosques. So it's very difficult to kind of, if you want to enforce some sort of code of practice, to do it kind of in isolation. So you have to approach every single one, while the majority are not kind of, you know, yes, there are a few of them who are registered, but the majority are too small to be kind of visible. Or, yeah. yeah, so informal madrasas are likely to lack the resources to become integrated into the wider supplementary school networks, and which means that they remain fairly invisible in the wider community. So if they are kind of, there were a few madrasas that we surveyed that we kind of that are operated from the kind of in houses, and so there were kind of small number of children that would attend. So these are, you know, completely invisible to, and would not have the capacity to sort of build their networks or kind of join a supplementary school network, etc. So all this makes it very difficult for local authorities or even researchers to engage with these institutions. So they do remain largely invisible, and despite, you know, their registration status and all that, but, you know, the majority do remain invisible. So in terms of kind of areas for change in terms of regulation, I think an effective system of registration which brings mainstream or madrasas into a single system of self-regulation would help to ensure the minimum standards are met in terms of best practice. And then it would also help to ensure greater integration between madrasas and increase their ability to network with other organizations. Now, the rest of the presentation is divided in kind of two different sections. So there's one where we look at the educational development and child welfare, so the kind of the impact of madrasas on these. And then the second one is on identity and community cohesion. So I'll start with the educational development and then go over some of the findings, and then talk over some of the recommendations that we put forward in the research. So the majority of madrasas included in the research survey used some sort of educational approaches which are used in supplementary schools. So for instance, they would divide students according to groups, sort of in their educational levels. They will have some sort of broad program of teaching. They will, yeah. And the second thing is that they also made attempts to kind of reach out to parents and involve parents, with about 90% of those responding to the survey said that they used formal channels for communicating with parents and about children, about their children's kind of development. So, for instance, they had some sort of parents' evening where they will meet with the parents to discuss their progress. They had some sort of formal correspondence with the parents, etc. In terms of approaches to teaching, these varied quite a lot. So, and the content of lesson as well. We couldn't really find a single kind of curriculum to say, you know, for instance, used by a number of madrasas. There was one exception, which I will come to later, but the majority had their own kind of curriculum, and this is really partly due to the kind of the different ethnic groups attending these madrasas. So, for instance, if we take the example of Moroccan supplementary schools or Moroccan madrasas, they would be using a curriculum that's used in Morocco, and this has been happening for years. So they will just use the same kind of textbooks, and the same is valid for other migrant groups. So, so the kind of when it comes to the kind of the core of the teaching, examples are often used referring to the kind of the country of origin, and not necessarily the kind of the British context. So, in terms of the quality of teachers, they really played the most crucial role in this whole process. And so their ability to speak English, to engage with the children, apart from the religious dimension, was absolutely crucial. So a lot of the respondents were saying that they made the most of lessons where they could talk the same language with the teacher, and that it wasn't kind of a teacher who's just come from overseas, who barely speaks any English, and who is really not able to relate to the context where the child lives, and or relate to any of the problems that they're facing, etc.